Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today, I think we have a very diverse set of conversations going, and we've just been considering what we really want to talk about. I have two guests with me, three guests, and what I call my co-host, Doug Saunders of the Globe and Mail, who's a columnist, and he tends to ask leading questions, and I really depend on that because today we've got to figure a common ground between the other two guests, Bob Hackett, who's a retired professor of communications at Simon Fraser University.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Here in BC.
Good. He's in British Columbia, and who's interested in, of course, the media. That is his main bag for his career. But as with all good citizens, he's also interested in issues about climate change. And in Washington, D.C., or in the vicinity, living on land that he says was once owned by George Washington, in a house that I guess was built after George Washington's day, is Paul Werbos. Yes, Werbos is a man of many parts. He is one of the founders, in a way, of artificial intelligence, having written 50 years ago a PhD thesis on neural networks, which now is very, very important as part of the new artificial intelligence. He also worked at the National Science Foundation for a long time and was in charge of deciding who got money for their projects, which means that he has a very diverse range of interests in science and is always on top of things. So, nice to see you.
Let's get the ball rolling and let's talk about prospects for climate change. I know Paul Werbos has ideas about best and worst case scenarios, prospects for interventions that might mitigate climate change and the changing set of political realities that might make those technological interventions possible. So you started this. Let's
okay. Yeah.
Let's hear from you.
You know, it's funny because we've touched on the future of internet, including media and climate. And I view these as the two biggest immediate threats to the survival of our species. I think the internet problems are bigger, but climate should be easier to understand. And it really amazes me how little real understanding there is, even in climate activists, about the nature and the solutions for the climate problem. I did not used to have climate at the top of my priority list. But in the year 2009, President Obama said this would be one of his two top priorities, climate legislation. And the National Science Foundation said, Paul, we want you to spend a year on detail with a key senator who had the balance of power on climate legislation. So we want you to go there and help them learn about real science and make policy based on reality. And so I spent that year. It was a great learning experience. In the beginning of the year, I read all the official international reports, the IPCC type reports. And those reports said, if we get it wrong, the world could lose 5% of its GNP in a century. And I looked at that and I said, you know, there are bigger issues. That was not my highest priority. I was more worried about US national security, about oil and energy, which is a big issue and always has been. But at the end of that year, I learned a lot. I learned a whole lot that whole year. I learned things which nobody else in the Senate knew, which the climate experts didn't know. Near the end of that year, I came back to the National Science Foundation for a big public talk led by the Geosciences Directorate of NSF, the #1 source of real scientific knowledge in what's happening in the world. And the director of Geosciences said, I want you to hear the talk of this guy, Peter Ward, who is unquestionably the world's expert on what has caused the mass extinctions of life on this planet in the last 500 million years. And he gave a talk which described this extinction and that extinction and how it worked. And at the end of the talk, he said, by the way, here are the curves for the past extinctions. Here's the curve on where we are now. I know these curves. I know this data. I look at this data. Guess what? We're in the middle of a rerun. My gut feeling is we're all about to die if we don't change this number. That was a shock. That was a wake up. Ever since then, I've tried to find out what is the real truth of the science. Should I believe him or shouldn't I? But that was the smaller shock. The shock I have yet to recover from was leaving that giant room full of experts, people interested in the real science. I may have been the only person walking out of that room with a question. Are we going to die or aren't we? And if we're going to die, what could kill us? What's the real science behind this? I was the only person who was full of that question. Everybody else was either saying, oh, that's climate stuff. I don't believe any climate stuff, whatever. And the other half would be, I'm politically correct. I support climate action. So that's the end of it. I'm a good person. They didn't ask, are we going to die or aren't we? And if we're going to die, what could kill us? And I didn't really know the full story until this year. I've read the literature. I've read the reports. There's a lot of work done since then. But it turns out just this year, I read a new book by Peter Ward and Kirschvink on the history of life on Earth. Buried in chapter 12 is a report of new research. And the new research, so far as I can tell, says, yes, we are in danger of extinction. We are in danger of changes in the ocean with low oxygen and nutrients from agricultural runoff, which together, if it isn't changed, if both of those things continue as they're continuing now, the question is, how many decades do humans have still to live on this planet? So I'm worried about that. And I try to do what I can to help. First, we got to get the word out. We got to nail down the science, but God help us, we better start taking precautionary action.
Let me pin you down. I think the other day you said that phosphorus was the big secret enemy. Is that right?
So in this book by Ward and Kirschvink on the history of life on Earth, very heavy book. Nobody's going to read all of it except for a few weird guys like me. But chapter 12 of that book reports on research by a guy named Kump at Penn State, where he was comparing different theories of the mass extinctions. Some people say, oh, it was volcanoes. And some people say, oh, it was something else. And Kump did a study where he looked at the low oxygen and he looked at the phosphate in the ocean. And it was the combination of the two that predicted where you start getting the poison gas that then kills everybody. So phosphate in the ocean and low oxygen in the deep ocean of the Pacific. Oxygen in the deep ocean of the Pacific and phosphate from agricultural runoff. Those are the best predictors of whether we live or die. That's the best we know. We can improve that science. We should be working to improve that science. You shouldn't just take my word for it or just read chapter 12. We need a major scientific effort to nail it down. But right now, the science is pretty clear that the phosphate fertilizer in the ocean and the low oxygen combined add up to a recipe for total death by H2S emission.
Okay, guys. We've got our assignment now.
Save the world!
Yeah.
Please!
Okay. What I want to know that may be relevant to what Bob has to offer is how come it's so hard to get this kind of information disseminated? If chapter 12 of this book has such a big and important thing to report and a warning to issue, I never heard of it. I know the other day you said something about phosphorus, and I thought, well, okay, phosphorus. I was worried about methane. So let's worry about both of them. But why is it that we cannot seem to get the word out? And the media, I don't know, you work on social media and digital media, et cetera, do you, Bob? What's your take on how we can alert people to these challenges?
I actually work on the traditional press, including the Globe and Mail, and that's still very important. There's not just legacy media, because newspaper organizations now have a significant online presence. So my work has really been on journalism and news organizations over the last 30 years. And in the last 5 or 6 years, looking specifically at journalism and climate crisis. This is a 2017 book, which is I co-authored with 3 other people. I think there's so many factors here. One is human psychology, isn't it? That we tend to veer between apathy and panic. And we're not very good, it seems, at addressing long-term crisis for which there's no immediate fix. And it's a very interesting comparison, isn't it, to look at how we respond to COVID versus how we respond to climate crisis. COVID is a situation in which you can take immediate response, right? There's an immediate threat, but your own individual action can make a difference. You know, wearing masks, getting vaccines, and so on. It's much harder to make that connection with climate crisis. So I think there's a kind of psychological barrier to overcome there, the way perhaps that we're wired. But I think we also have to look at the institutions within which we generate stories and within which we produce and consume goods, our economy. And there's one school of thought that says our economic system is inherently expansionist, that economic growth is part of the DNA of capitalism. And that it's the eco-socialist school of thought, right? That says that we're not going to resolve environmental problems unless we address the governing logic of an economic system that insists on continual capital accumulation, regardless of the social and environmental costs. So that's very difficult to do because, unlike COVID, there's a lot of vested interest in maintaining the status quo with respect to climate action. And I think we can't ignore the power of what have been called the energy incumbents, the fossil fuel industry, over, in particular, discourse in Canada. I think Canadian media, as generators of cultural stories, are behind other countries like Europe in particular in pointing to the dangers of climate action or climate crisis and what we ought to do about it. And it's partly because of the, I think, disproportionate influence of fossil fuel industries over our economy and our cultural narratives. So that's a start to addressing the problem. I suppose there's a bigger problem as well of science reporting in general, that Canadians generally seem to be scientifically illiterate. We don't get enough understanding. It's even more the case in the United States, given the kind of make-believe worlds that are being manufactured through social media and by politicians like Trump. We need more scientific literacy. I think that's a real problem for journalists who are trying to speak, to convey science to broader publics and what the science is telling us.
Okay, let me see if I can offend everybody by asking Doug to comment on something that, if it's true, you don't want to comment on. That is, we hear among, left-oriented people are always saying, well, the reason we don't get coverage of this or that in the media is because the media is owned by vested interests that simply will not allow anybody to publish things that are not considered supportive of their interests. And the only time I ever said such thing in public was at a meeting in Kingston many years ago, where there were a lot of journalists in the audience who practically jumped to their feet yelling at me, saying that's not true. So both of you guys have have no doubt dealt with that question. And I don't know whether that's implicit in what you said, Bob. And if so, are you aiming our target at Doug for belonging to an outfit that is paid for by vested interests, and therefore he's not free to say what he pleases? Now I've got everybody going, I bet.
Matt, I always welcome questions like that. I mean, I can't, I'm just a practitioner. I've been a writer for the last 30 years, except for a brief stint as an editor, which was of a startup online thing within the organization. So I haven't covered media organizations since the 1990s. So I only have expertise in this structure of media organizations as someone who seeks to write stuff and provocative stuff and troublesome stuff and that sort of thing. I can say I've never had any difficulty or resistance to writing whatever I want, including things that offend the economic interests of the owner of the organization. There was a brief period when the organization I write for, when a slice of it was owned by a media company, Bell, and I do know that the executives of them during that period in the early 2000s did attempt, with mixed and generally not much success, to interfere with some coverage. So it has been known to happen, but it's now just owned by an individual and a family. There tends to be a difference in media organizations between those that are publicly owned, so that are traded on the stock exchange, and those that are privately owned, either by wealthy individuals like the Globe and Mail, or by trusts such as the New York Times or the Guardian, which are officially not profit-seeking organizations, but are still have this sort of individualistic form of ownership. Now, it doesn't tend to interfere with the general ability to write or produce for television or radio things that are shocking or offensive or challenge the status quo, because those things tend to get read by a lot of people, and they tend to attract the sort of subscriptions and things like that that attract advertisers. So the idea that people can't write things because they're going to shock the status quo, there's usually a big appetite for that sort of stuff. We can talk about climate messaging because and I should say, just to get back to that dichotomy, with publicly traded organizations, the mechanism tends to be, because those things generate subscription revenues and readership. I'd say before 2010, the big desire in media organizations was readers, was to get clicks, was to get uniques, as they would say. And since 2010 or 11 or 12 or thereabouts, the whole idea of getting the most people to read an individual article has kind of died away, and the mechanisms have more to do with attracting the most subscriptions. Advertising has the idea to attracting advertisers has declined as a motive for media organizations, as advertising has disappeared as a major slice of the revenue pie during the last 10 years. So we've seen a shift in for-profit media organizations toward different forms of communication as the profit motive has shifted toward attracting readership, subscribership, rather than pure advertising plays. And interestingly, what I know of is that the shift has generally been toward longer and more thoughtful stuff. Media organizations have realized that their important readership tends to be an elite, educated readership. Things like Twitter have created an appetite for long reads and essays and things like that. And it tends to be a battle for forms of engagement. Anyway, that's all backdrop to, I suppose, the underlying question of how this affects climate messaging.
No, but before you say that, just in general, have you ever known any colleague who's been swatted for having said something that bothered an advertiser or the owner of a publication?
those are two separate questions. I think any of the sort of elite publications or broadcast outlets would damage themselves by swatting down anything that offended an advertiser. That Chinese wall is generally kept fairly secure. Now, owners of outlets are a whole complicated situation. And I will say there are media outlets that are owned by individuals or families that do interfere with those publications. I mean, there was a national newspaper in Canada that was started in 1998 by one wealthy guy who made it his mission to, impose his personal vision on its content. So
You don't like to use the word National Post?
Sure.
Okay.
And then he went to prison, and now it's run by a board that also tends to interfere and that sort of thing. Owner interference is it's never a total thing. It's never like you're banned from writing about this, but it's often a chaotic thing from moment to moment. But that's the price of individual ownership. I mean, some of the nicest places to work for are places like the New York Times and the Guardian that are owned by trusts. Except in the latter case, they lose a lot of money, and they have an internal politics that makes it difficult to work at as well. So there's no ideal structure of ownership. Generally, I wouldn't work anywhere where I felt my work was interfered with or guided or in any way. And I don't think many credible people would. And you do see career moves away from organizations where that happens. It's not a career that pays very well. So unless you're in television, you don't go seeking the highest salary or anything. But generally, if you have any self-respect, you seek the places where you can operate with the least interference with your work. So there's also that trade-off. But yeah, definitely there are that any owner or group of, so the publicly traded ones, media outlets tend to have less of that direct form of interference because it would hurt shareholder value. Whereas the private ones have more opportunity for that sort of interference because they often are vanity projects. But it's a mixed bag. I'm not a huge fan of being owned by a billionaire, but the Washington Post is now owned by Jeff Bezos, famously controversial, wealthy guy. But I know a lot of people who write there, and he has not yet interfered with the content of the Washington Post. That's not to say it's not possible, including the fact that the Washington Post has been able to break some of the more negative investigative stories about his company, Amazon, that other papers have not been able to get. And he did give them free rein to break stories critical and harmful to Amazon. I don't think I'd feel too safe knowing that. I don't advocate for billionaire takeovers of media outlets. Just that particular one has generally been good for the Washington Post.
Good. Bob, you must have thoughts.
Thank you. Yes. I think it's a bit of a misdirection to look for direct owner intervention in editorial decision making. I just published a study with Hannah Araza of the post-media chain. It's published in the CCPA, Center for Policy Alternatives Monitor, just last month. And what accounts for its conservative orientation and its sort of outright climate denialism in some cases. And it's not necessarily through direct top-down directives, although that does occur. It's more likely to occur in post-media than I think in some other media companies. But so I agree with Doug that ownership forms do make a difference, but it has less to do with direct intervention than it has to do with things like market positioning, with management's decisions over who to hire, particularly as opinion columnists. They're especially important in post-media. They get circulated and recirculated through pro-petro, pro-fossil fuel net social media networks. the conservative political orientation of the post-media board, and their search for revenue streams, and their conscious attempt to position themselves to address a certain portion of the potential market, the conservative segment of about 1/3 of the electorate, for example, and to leave the other media companies to compete for the rest. So I think the problem is more structural than one of direct intervention, although again it does occur, and Post-Media is very explicitly and trying to impose an even more consistent right-wing editorial policy throughout its member newspapers. But again, so I think so we need, in a pluralist society, we need different forms of ownership. So I agree with you, Doug, that we need, not only publicly owned or publicly traded companies, but we need publicly owned in the sense that of CBC or Knowledge Network out here in British Columbia, the educational TV networks, or the growing garden, if you will, of independent digital startups. Like we had the Tyee, going back almost a veteran now, started in 2003, National Observer, Narwhal. There's now a new one coming out called The Breach. So there's, and many others. Pete's Magazine I would put in there as well. We need those kinds of specialized publications in a pluralist society, and they all have a role to play in calling attention to climate crisis and offering solutions that are independent of both state and corporate power. And that's why I think we need independent media that are not owned by private sector corporations or billionaires. Very much so. We need more of them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Does this give us any hint as to the original question? I was wondering, how can we get more coverage of really threatening things like phosphorus and methane? And frankly, I think that the IPCC, from what I've heard, they are already too tame. They're 2 or 3 years behind schedule. What they publish is not brand new, and they're cautious and not very bold about issuing great serious warnings. So the people that I know who do work on the Arctic methane issue, which I think scared me the worst until Paul said something about phosphorus, those things are not, we don't hear about them in time. And what can we do about that, if anything?
I think there's a big information problem with climate and the internet. And with climate, I mentioned there were the people on the left and on the right who were equally scary to me when I left that meeting on human extinction. They're the people who say climate is all nonsense, but there are people who say I'm politically correct and that's all I have to worry about. And we get polarized. What we need is a flow of information that brings the detailed content we need. There are people who know there's a human extinction story. They don't know where it's coming from. It's there in the science. What is the gap between the science and both political parties? All of the factions have a problem with inadequate information. And let me say there's another information gap that's just as important as extinction. And that is there are low-cost solutions to the problem. There are efficient, cost-effective ways to use advanced technology and microeconomics so that we don't have to pay an arm and a leg to solve the problem. But I have not seen any legislation anywhere in the world which appears to be well informed by the positive good news on what we really could be doing on climate. And I might say we owe Meta thanks because she's brought a guy here, Mike Barnard, to talk about what we can do to solve these climate problems more efficiently. It's kind of scary if Meta becomes the best hope of the human species. But it really is important that somebody is there getting the information out, that we don't have to give $10 trillion to somebody's favorite vested interest to solve these problems. There's good news as well as bad news that needs to get out there better to both political parties.
Mm-hmm. Ask about what you think good climate reporting and messaging would look like, because I do think the messages that have come both from the media and from advocacy organizations have not necessarily been ideal at moving the hands of the clock in the right direction all the time. I think things have changed a little bit in the last few years, but generally a lot of the messaging has been either we're doomed, various projections like Paul's talking about and so on, or they're, as Paul also says, they're consumer-oriented behavioral messages. You should recycle, that sort of thing. And that's partly because, speaking to what Bob says, there is a market for both those things. People really want to read we're doomed stories. People really like
You do? Really?
really bad news, especially if there's a they behind it, right? We're doomed because of the oil companies. That is always a big seller.
Really? That
and-
bothers me when you say that, because my impression is that people don't want to read such things and immediately turn it off if they hear things.
No, well, part of the problem is people don't act on hearing that because they sit there contented that, you know, their moral compass was in line and we told you so. So a lot of climate organizations did messaging things during the last 20 years, showing, you know, a baked planet and blasted wastelands and that sort of thing. And it turned people off of being engaged in climate policy, that sort of thing. And then of course you have the flip side, which is the consumer side, which is a bit of a red herring. It also satisfies a moral imperative in readers and viewers to feel like they've done something because they've given to a charity or they've recycled or they've bought an electric car or something like that. And of course, we do know that the solutions to the warming crisis are not on the consumer level. That's a tiny 5% slice of the whole thing. And they're probably not even on the level of individual smaller countries. They're individual on the level of electrical generation grids for entire countries and a few other really huge industrial things. If China and the United States could become carbon neutral in the next 20 years, then we would escape the 2-degree warming problem. And I think some of the idea that this messaging the stories we should be doing, the messaging should be around policy, it should be around things like that. And also the notion that these are doable things, that policy actions on behalf of your government not only will prevent this, but will make your life better. If you can have a carbon neutral economy, then there's no such thing as waste. And you can use it as much as you want. I mean, I live in a province with a carbon neutral electrical grid most days. Occasionally 3 or 4% of it is natural gas. As a consequence, there's no such thing as waste other than whatever money I want to spend on it. I can buy a 6,000 watt heater from my shed and feel guiltless because I'm not contributing to it. And we have a number of major countries in the world that have reached the carbon transition where each unit of economic growth, each per capita dollar GDP of economic growth, instead of increasing carbon output, decreases carbon output. So the more economic growth you can produce, the more climate mitigation you produce. Ooh. So the policy questions that are interesting and that I don't think are publicly appreciated are, how do we get the larger countries, how do we help the larger countries get to the point where they can be in this virtuous cycle part of the carbon economy where growth equals positive transition.
Okay, now I've really got you. Are you really saying that? And can you back this up? This is this most surprising thing I've heard yet, that the economic growth is leading to reduction in carbon emissions?
Only in countries that have reached, but Canada is not one of those countries. In Canada, we are still at a point, although the relationship between economic growth and carbon output has slowed, like we could reach that point, but Canada in large part because of its petroleum production, but also because of its as I've written, of its underpopulation, its inefficient transportation network caused by low population density, still isn't a point where economic growth means an increase in carbon output per capita, whereas many other economies, including some of the largest European ones, are now at a point where each additional dollar of economic growth causes a decrease in carbon output. It's not a hard transition to make, and I think if people appreciated the fact that you're not going to have a decline in quality of living or a need for decreased growth when you reach a carbon neutral economy. In fact, you can have a better quality of living and more growth if you can switch coal to nuclear, if you can cause the transportation grid to be electrical rather than petroleum, if you can do the important things in your country necessary to make a carbon transition.
I'm trying to set up a show specifically about that question. Can we have prosperity without economic growth? So come back and let's talk about it.
I think it's clear you cannot have growing prosperity without economic growth, and it would be ridiculous to ask people who've just moved out of subsistence poverty to produce a decline in their standard of living. But you can have the idea that a carbon transition that escaping the 2-degree warming, and hopefully better than that, because 2 degrees is still pretty bad, requires some return to subsistence economies or degrowth or something like that. It's not backed by any economic thinking. It's a fallacy, and it's partly a misunderstanding of how the technologies behind carbon work, what a zero carbon economy looks like. I mean, if we look at the electrical grid of a place like this, it shows that once you get to the point where production of energy and transportation does not release carbon, then you can talk about a situation where you can have a lot more growth while causing a decrease in warming.
Can I just raise a question?
Paul, do you guys agree with him?
No. No, well, at least I have a question. As Doug, you just posed the alternative as between economic growth and sort of general impoverishment. There's another that excludes a third alternative, which I think we can have something like steady state economies without impoverishment if we raise the question of redistribution of wealth and power. And that's I think the fundamental question that we have to address. There's something like 27 to 36 trillion dollars apparently stored away by the world's mega rich in places like the Cayman Islands. And if we could access that kind of wealth and use it to help solve the world's problems, we're talking about a political as well as an economic revolution here. But I think could well be what it takes. Redistribution, not perpetual growth. But I would be very interested to see that if there's a kind of growth in an economic system that depends upon continual capital accumulation, I'd like to see the evidence. And it's very interesting, Doug, that you raise it.
I like the sounds of what you're saying. I'm in favor of redistributive systems, and I should point out that the countries with the most robust redistributive systems, the Scandinavian economies, so on, also have produced the greatest economic growth as a consequence of that. I've often argued that social democratic systems which merge fairly free market economy with a redistributive state, using the one to fuel the other, they tend to mutually produce both a lot of growth and a lot of well-being, because they depend on an activist state using that redistribution to bring about a greater good. Now, you need to watch out with what you're saying for what some people call the lump of money fallacy. The idea that there's fixed amount of money that pools up over here and you can rake it out over here and so on. I mean, yes, we should have more progressive taxation of very wealthy people. Yes, we should crack down on tax evasion shelters, including offshore banking things. I was very pleased to see the G7's new commitment for consistent reporting. We've seen a few steps. The United States has gotten rid of Swiss bank accounts and other forms of tax shelters. Interestingly, the US has been much more successful than other countries in cracking down on tax evasion shelters. But anyway, we need to do that. But we need to also watch out for this idea that wealth is something that is a fixed stock of money that sits over here and can be moved over there. I mean, what creates wealth and growth is not moving existing money around. It's creating economic activity. It's creating human engagement, people doing things with each other and engaging with each other. That creates wealth at the ground level and creates income much more than redistributing existing piles should. So while we should have a progressive tax system and avoid tax shelters, we need to look for creating wealth on the ground. We need to start recognizing that, for example, immigrants are creators of wealth rather than consumers of employment, and that sort of thing, and make sure that those forms of economic activity at the grassroots are carbon neutral.
So my claim is most of the climate legislation has been a total disaster in terms of the amount of money it would cost relative to the real benefits to the climate. When Greta Thunberg talks about the COP25 and how utterly ineffective the European measures were, I think she's understating the case. And the real question is, why has it been so much less effective than it might be? I remember once I ran an international discussion group on climate connected with the Millennium Project. And one of the frustrating things was we have greenhouse gases coming from electricity, from vehicles, from the agricultural sector. We wanted to talk about what we could do. But there were people who said, but the real problem is evil. The real problem is capitalism. The real problem is greed. The problem is sin. And you sit there and say, yeah, let's not give up worrying about sin, but this is a discussion on climate. And there are things we can do on climate which would be very efficient if we learned how to focus our minds one thing at a time. Let's not forget about sin. Let's not forget about all these other things. They're important, but we need to make some time to ask ourselves really effectively, what can we do about the sources of greenhouse gases? And there are basically three of them: electricity, vehicles, and the way we do agriculture. And in every one of these sectors, I look at the global philosophical thinkers. The best of them say, let's impose a carbon tax because economic theory says it'll solve everything. But that's not how it works in these sectors. In each of these sectors, there are efficient things we could do that are very concrete, that are very, very concrete, things we could do that have nothing to do with these sort of global band-aids people talk about. One example is how we generate electricity in the United States. I know a lot about that because for several years, I was in charge of the NSF research program on technology for the electric power grid. We learned a lot about how the grid really works. If I had to say what's the number one thing you could do to get rid of greenhouse gases in the US from electricity generation, would be to actually do something that Donald Trump proposed to do that he never did. And that is to rationalize the regulations. We have systems of federal regulation which encourage the use of coal and fossil fuel and discourage the use of renewable electricity across states. And there was a guy named Pickens who wanted to build big wind farms and solar farms in Texas. It wasn't economic then, but now it would compete very well. If you were allowed to build the wires Pickens wanted to build from Texas to the East Coast US, it could compete. We wouldn't need these other damn sources. And we wouldn't need to waste money on expensive rooftop solar that most people aren't going to pay for. And you wouldn't need the coal and you wouldn't need the nuclear. And the bottom line is we have new technologies in solar and wind we could deploy today, but regulation is what's getting in the way. Changing the law to allow market competition. This is just one example of many things we could do, but the ideological stuff doesn't work. It's the concrete actually doing what we say we're going to do that could solve these problems. But the problem is the policymakers don't know about it because they got all these global thinkers and they got all these vested interests, and we need the information flow from reality to the policy level.
I'm interested in that language you're using, Paul, and I don't know, Bob, what you think about that, but I mean, partly because I've never heard anybody cite Donald Trump as a model for is deregulatory. But although I should say, I think Mr. Trump's deregulatory impetus was designed with the end goal of increasing the amount of coal in the grid.
What he said and what he did were different.
However, I'd like to take your point, and one thing that I think is important, this speaks to what Bob was saying about media, is that a lot of our climate messaging from both organizations and political parties and the media is oriented toward speaking to people who already believe, who are progressive minded or liberal minded, and so on. And we're not very good at coming up with a climate message that gets conservatives, and in particular conservative governments, on board to do policy things that will make a difference. So what Paul's saying is interesting, because first of all, I do think messaging that climate, that a positive climate transition is good for profit, will bring conservatives on board. Let's face it, most major Western countries will have conservative governments over the next 50 years from time to time, even if the general momentum is in the opposite direction. So Paul, you're suggesting that deregulation can be the route to positive climate outcomes, I think is an important message. I don't know to what extent it's true, but certainly deregulation of some things, allowing a greater market. Because I would like that, I would like the Post-Media newspaper chain, for example, to become positive toward climate solutions rather than opposed to carbon pricing and things like that, while still being conservative. I would like the Conservative Party to become more positive about those while still being conservative. We're not going to make people change their ideological camp, but if we can build, I mean, the other example that I could think was the move to try to get right-wing parties to be in favor of racial diversity and immigration and things like that, which succeeded. You know, it succeeded in Canada and Britain and Germany. And it required an acknowledgement on the people working on those fronts that they're going to be conservative parties. You're not going to like their policies. You're not going to be happy when they're in power, but you can at least have them be a party that is not racist when they're in power, which worked in Canada and Britain and Germany and didn't really work in France or the United States. But you could do that with climate too. You could say, let's try to work. We have the liberal and progressive parties on our side. What can we do with the conservative parties, the right-wing parties, to cause them to be favorable toward positive climate policy solutions without necessarily being something we like in any other respect? And Paul suggests one direction that way. Bob, do you think that's possible?
I think it is. There's work by Lazarus and his colleagues at Yale, you know, the Public Opinion Tribe research, coming up with the conclusion that you need different kinds of frames, different ways to frame the message of climate action for different opinion groups within the population. And that question is also addressed by a really interesting Canadian book, which I hope you're familiar with, Doug, by Seth Klein, called A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency.
A great book by a really good author, yes.
It is, yeah, and it's what I like about it is that it addresses the scale of the problem, the challenge, but also has really down-to-earth policy approaches and solutions to it, drawn upon Canada's own historical experience of mobilizing in World War II, right? It's using that analogy. We did all kinds of things when the job was really important. And ironically, as he's just completing the book, the COVID pandemic broke out and gave us a real world example, a current, you know, on time example of how governments can respond with a really focused way when they recognize that there's a real emergency, an existential emergency that needs addressing. So I think that's actually a very hopeful and realistic book. So,
I did a talk show with him, by the way.
okay. And I
Well,
think
if we can get to Meta's favorite question from that, are big emergency mobilizations, and I don't know whether that involves dumping iron filings into the ocean or petrochar or whatever the latest thing is. Let's put aside the big technology question. I don't think that's one for this moment. But Bob, you suggested a big mobilization. The COVID example provides. Can we shift the public optimism around the public sector being able to mobilize from this emergency to the next and ongoing one, which is climate? I mean, we did see an amazing thing happen around COVID. I think the media focuses too much on the pockets of denialism and dissent and that sort of thing. But the big picture is that a whole bunch of governments were able to corral private sector actors into producing an awful lot of vaccines in an amazingly short time. So Bob, how optimistic are you that we could make that shift, that voting publics could say, we did this, maybe we can do it with this other thing that threatens us?
Moderately optimistic, because I see it already happening, that people now recognize that we do need the public sector. We need public health. I mean, that's much higher in the agenda now. And the climate is also a public health issue, right? So I think there's ways of making that connection between how we dealt with COVID and how we can next deal with the climate emergency, which is a much bigger, let's face it, challenge. It's a more amorphous question and so on. But I think people now do seem to be more ready for public sector and policy-oriented solutions on a grand scale. I think in a way that many sectors of the public are ahead of governments in this respect. And I have to say, I don't want to, to boast my own province, but we did relatively well with a government that takes seriously science and public health. And I hope and Oregon just got reelected with a big majority because of the way they handle it. And it's by contrast with our next door neighbor in Alberta, where they're just a conservative government is blundering from one extreme to the other in trying to deal with this emergency. And so I think there is a shift that I hope can be transposed to how we deal with climate emergency.
Paul, you've got a finger on the science there. From what you know and what you see in the literature, does it look to you like a large-scale mobilization and public spending and investment initiatives and maybe some big science as well are capable in a realistic political world of overcoming and avoiding some of the dangerous tripwires that you're seeing as far as things like release of stored gases from ices and the ocean and that sort of thing?
Sometimes I've been at these futurist conferences where they end up saying, will humans still be here in 1,000 years or not? And when everybody lined up on one side or the other, I stood in the middle and said it would be irresponsible for me to say, yes, we will survive, or no, we won't. And the reason is that we are playing a game of probabilities. And the game is to improve our probability of survival. I have to say, from day to day, we aren't there yet. I was really excited when Biden picked John Kerry, of all people, who worries about the precautionary principle. Kerry did a lot to make me feel more optimistic. And he made me more optimistic when he went before the UN Security Council and said, we need an office on human survival with a climate division that's really intellectually serious and gives the world the information it needs. That was encouraging. But since then, the politics is still bogged down. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So we need to work on helping the left hand know what the right hand is doing. That's Meta's work, but we all have to help with that work. The work is not yet done. If we stop here, we are all dead. I look at the forces in play right now. If we don't do something new, we are still all dead. But if we keep at it, I think there's hope. The opportunities are there.
Well, the main thing is if we have issues of that magnitude where you think that the extinction of the human species, or even all species on Earth, because the extinction events were, so one of them knocked out 95% of all living creatures. If that's the kind of thing we're talking about, and we change the subject because we do or don't like to read about bad news, then we're really done for. But I don't know how to get people to listen to. I think, Doug, you say people like that kind of story. I don't see that. I don't see people wanting to hear bad news like that. I think they would like to say, well, don't worry about it.
But my colleague Shane Gunster and others have done research on using focus groups and so on how people do respond to different kinds of climate news. And I think you're actually right that they don't like simply gloom and doom. It is disempowering. It sort of numbs people. People do want to be warned of threats, but they also want to feel that there's some way that they can do something about it. So I think we do need what some people call solutions journalism. And there's a conscious movement on that in the United States and Canada as well, to do journalism reporting that looks at how different aspects of solutions to climate crisis, from what individuals are doing in their own communities to what policies have worked in other jurisdictions. I think there's an appetite for that. It does take work and investment, and maybe that's one of the reasons that there isn't more of it. But I think obviously people want to be made aware of threats to their well-being, so that we do gravitate towards train wrecks, right? We slow down and look at car accidents on the highway, and consider ourselves lucky that it's not us. But so there is that kind of curiosity about disasters, but there's very much an appetite and a need for solutions as well, ways that empower us as individuals and as communities.
People don't act on negative news. People do consume it. People, if I write a book, I work in that policy space, in reporting on policy actions that can be taken and best solutions and that sort of thing, on the solutions oriented side of things. But I should say, if I publish a book on here's why your doom and gloom is wrong and here's what we need to do to fix it, it will sell 1/10 the copies of a book saying we are all doomed and it's because they did this, right? That is always the biggest selling title. But people don't act on that. You're right, because it satisfies their sense of guilt, and it leaves them feeling like they shouldn't act because they're just pawns of a big system. I think what I'm taking from what Paul said is that we need to move from a Catholic style climate messaging, which is that this is sin and you need penance, to a more Calvinist approach, or choose your non-penance oriented faith system. I'm not a theologist, but something more related to, let's call it Calvinism, the personal witness of God, the person, in this case, the personal engagement with climate and policy, maybe through the mediating arm of governments. So, look, it does get reported on. If you type Arctic methane climate into the Google News window, you'll find quite a bit of reporting during the last year. It just doesn't make headlines because it doesn't change.
Paul, you get the last word.
Well, forever we're struggling with balance, hopes and fears. Mammal brains have been like that since before humans were born. We need to strengthen our hopes and our fears and get real about both of them.
Good idea. I will.
Amen.
Get real. Thank you all. This has been fun, interesting, and let us hope also actually useful to somebody in this world. Take care. Bye.